I always believed trust was simple. I thought if I loved honestly, life would return the favor. My name is Ethan Miller, and for most of my life, I trusted two people without question. I trusted my girlfriend, Olivia Carter, with my heart. I trusted my older brother, Ryan Miller, with my back. Relax, Ethan, Olivia used to say, smiling as she stole fries from my plate. You worry too much. I don't worry, I'd reply. I plan. Ryan would laugh from across the table. That's my little brother. Always serious. Those weekends felt safe. Friday dinners at my parents' house. My dad, Mark, pouring drinks. My mom, Susan, asking about work. Ryan talking about promotions and trips. Olivia squeezing my hand under the table. You picked a good one, my mom told me once. She's patient with you. I smiled. She's everything. Ryan raised his glass. To Ethan, finally settling down. We laughed. I believed it. After dinner, Ryan helped me wash dishes. You're lucky, he said. Not everyone gets someone like her. I know, I said. I don't take it lightly. Ryan nodded. Good. Don't. Later that night, Olivia called me. Did Ryan say anything weird? Weird how? I asked. I don't know, she said quickly. Forget it. You sure you're okay? I asked again. I said I'm fine, she replied. Why are you pushing? I'm not, I said. I just care. There was a pause. I know, she said softly. Ryan was always ahead of me. Better job. Better car. More confidence. I never felt jealous. I felt proud. He was my brother. Blood didn't compete. Blood protected. Call me if you ever need anything, Ryan told me one night. I've got you. I know, I said. Always. Olivia started changing slowly. Nothing dramatic. Just small things I explained away. Sorry, busy today. She texted more often. You okay? I'd ask. Yeah, she'd say, not meeting my eyes. Just tired. You sure? I asked once. She forced a smile. Ethan, please. Don't overthink. Ryan noticed before I did. Or maybe he noticed something else. She seems stressed, he told me casually. Work stuff. Probably, I said. She'll tell me when she's ready. At dinner, my dad clapped Ryan on the shoulder. You're doing great, son. I wish Ethan had your drive. I laughed to hide the sting. Someone has to be average. My mom added, Ryan just knows what he wants. I do too, I said. I just move slower. Ryan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Olivia laughed too, a little late. Jake, my best friend, pulled me aside one night. You're happy, right? Of course, I said. Why? He shrugged. Just checking. Don't start, I warned. I'm not, he said. Just don't ignore your gut. That night, my mom called. You sound tired, she said. I'm good, I replied. Just busy. Ryan helps when things get hard, she said. Lean on him. I always do, I said. Sometimes I caught myself watching them together, laughing, talking easily. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself trust meant not questioning love or blood. I told myself doubt was weakness, and faith was strength. I believed silence kept peace, loyalty kept families whole, and love survived everything, even small doubts I refused to name. I felt safe believing that version of my life. I ignored the question. I ignored the late replies. I ignored how Olivia flinched when Ryan walked into a room. I ignored how Ryan suddenly knew details about my plans. You told him? Olivia asked once. Yeah, I said. He's my brother. She nodded. Right. Of course. My mom hugged me goodbye after dinner. Family sticks together, she said softly. I know, I replied. On the drive home, I talked about the future. We could travel, I said. Get engaged next year. Olivia stared ahead. That's a lot. I just mean someday, I said quickly. Someday, she repeated. I reached for her hand. Whatever pace you want. She squeezed back. You're good, Ethan. I love you, I said. I love you too, she replied. I believed love meant patience. I believed family meant protection. I believed trust was unbreakable. I was wrong. I noticed the first crack on a Thursday night when Olivia texted, "Can we rain check again?" Work ran late. I stared at my phone and typed, "Third time this week." She replied, "I know. I'm sorry." I asked, "Are you really okay?" She sent, "Please don't start." I deleted my reply and wrote, "All right." Silence followed, loud enough to fill my apartment. Ryan called an hour later. "So, you're still thinking about proposing next year?" he asked. I froze. "How do you know that?" I said. He laughed lightly. "You mentioned it before." I said, "Not to you." Another pause. "Relax," he said. "I just pay attention." I told myself that made sense. Brothers talked. Brothers noticed. Jake showed up with takeout. "You look wrecked," he said. I shrugged. "Long week." He sat across from me. "You sure it's work?" I said, "Drop it." He leaned back. "Ethan, something's off." I snapped, "You don't know that." He replied, "I know you." I said, "Then trust me." He sighed. "I am. I just don't trust what you're ignoring." I changed the subject and asked about his job. He let it go, but his eyes stayed worried. Saturday brought my parents' anniversary dinner. Olivia arrived late. "Traffic," she said, breathless. Ryan stood to pull out her chair. "You made it," he said, smiling too easily. I joked, "We were about to start without you." Olivia laughed, then avoided my eyes. My dad raised a toast. "To family," he said. My mom added, "And success." Ryan clinked glasses with everyone. "Cheers," he said. During appetizers, Ryan said, "Ethan, didn't you say you might move closer to downtown?" I blinked. "I was thinking about it," I said. "I didn't decide." Olivia looked up sharply. "Move?" she asked. I said, "It was just an idea." Ryan waved a hand. "It makes sense for your commute." I nodded, confused. I had only mentioned it once, to Olivia late at night. I felt my chest tighten. I forced a smile and said, "We'll see." My mom leaned toward Ryan. "You always give good advice," she said. Olivia smiled at him, soft and private. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself nerves could fake patterns. I told myself trust meant staying calm. Between courses, I went to the hallway for air. I heard voices near the study. Olivia whispered, "Not here." Ryan replied, "He won't notice." She said, "This is getting risky." I stepped back as a laugh from the dining room covered my breath. My hands shook. I waited, then returned with a practiced grin. At the table, Olivia touched my arm. "You okay?" she asked. I said, "Yeah." Ryan watched us closely. I joked about dessert. Everyone laughed. I chewed without tasting. My heart argued with my head. One said I was paranoid. The other said I wasn't stupid. On the drive home, Olivia stared out the window. I said, "You were quiet." She replied, "Long day." I asked, "Are we good?" She said, "Why wouldn't we be?" I answered, "Just checking." She said, "You always check." I nodded, "Because I care." She exhaled. "I know." I parked and turned to her. "Can we talk tomorrow?" I asked. She hesitated. "About what?" I said, "Us." She looked at me, then nodded. "Okay." I watched her walk inside and felt the ground shift under my feet. That night, Jake texted, "Trust your gut." I typed, "I'm fine." I wasn't. I lay awake replaying words, pauses, glances. I didn't want to accuse. I didn't want to explode. I wanted truth, clean and honest, because I still believed truth could protect what I loved. I sat alone and argued with myself. I said, "You're tired." I answered, "You're afraid." I said, "Trust them." I answered, "Trust yourself." My phone buzzed, then stopped. I imagined questions I wouldn't ask and answers I wasn't ready to hear. I promised myself I wouldn't accuse or shout. I would listen. I would ask calmly,
I would let her speak.
If I was wrong, I would apologize. If I was right, I would face it. I believed honesty fixed cracks before they became breaks. By morning, I decided to talk to Olivia, not with anger, but with truth, because I still believed truth could save us. I hoped patience mattered, that love listened, that families stayed solid, and that one honest conversation could steady my shaking hands and stop the night from swallowing everything before dawn broke and forced decisions. I met Olivia at my place the next evening. I said, "Sit down." She stayed standing. "What's wrong?" she asked. I said, "I just want to talk." She crossed her arms. "You always say that." I replied, "Because it matters." I asked, "Are you happy with me?" She said, "Why are you asking?" I said, "Please answer." She looked at the floor. "I care about you." I said, "That's not what I asked." She sighed. "Ethan, don't do this." I said, "Just tell me the truth." She said, "You're making this bigger than it is." I asked, "Did I do something wrong?"
She shook her head.
"No," I asked. "Then why do you feel so far away?" She said, "Work, stress, life." I said, "Say my name when you say that." She whispered, "Ethan." My chest felt tight. I said, "Have you lied to me?" She looked up too fast. "No," I asked. "Are you sure?" She said, "Why are you interrogating me?" I said, "Because I'm scared." She went quiet. I said, "Is there someone else?" She laughed once. "You're being dramatic." I said, "Answer me." She said, "I love you." I said, "That's not an answer." She rubbed her hands together. "You're spiraling." I said, "I'm asking." My ears rang. I said, "Is it Ryan?" She stopped breathing. The room felt smaller. She stared at the wall. I said, "Olivia." "Nothing." I said, "Please." Silence pressed on my chest. My throat closed. I tasted metal. I said, "Say no." She didn't. I sat down hard. "How long?" I asked. She said, "It wasn't supposed to happen." I said, "That's not time." She said, "It started by accident." I laughed, broken. "Accidents don't repeat," I said. She said, "We didn't plan it." I said, "You continued." She said, "I didn't mean to hurt you." I said, "But you did." She said, "I was confused." I said, "You chose." She said, "It just felt easy." That word cut deepest. I said, "Easy to betray me?"
She cried. "Please don't yell."
I said, "I'm not yelling." My voice shook anyway. I asked, "Did he touch you?" She whispered, "Yes." I asked, "Did you stop him?" She said, "Not at first."
My heart slammed.
I said, "Did you tell him about me?" She said, "He already knew." I said, "Of course he did." I stood up. "Do you love him?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "That's enough." She reached for me. "Ethan, wait." I stepped back. "Don't." She said, "We can fix this." I said, "You already broke it." I walked out and called Ryan. He answered calm. "Hey, little brother." I said, "How long?" He said, "You should relax." I said, "Did you sleep with her?" He said, "You're emotional." I said, "Answer me." He said, "It wasn't serious." I said, "You're my brother." He said, "That doesn't give you ownership." I said, "It gives you limits." He said, "You're overreacting." I felt hollow. I said, "You betrayed me." He said, "You'll understand someday." I hung up shaking. My pain didn't come from shouting. It came from calm voices explaining why my trust didn't matter. I realized betrayal doesn't scream. It explains. It justifies. It smiles and tells you you're too sensitive while your world collapses quietly inside you. I leaned against my car and breathed through the ache. I said out loud, "This can't be real." My phone buzzed. Olivia texted, "Please come back." I typed, "I need space." She replied, "Ryan didn't mean it." I laughed. "Neither did you," I whispered. Ryan texted next. "Don't make this ugly." I answered, "You already did." He wrote, "You're acting like a victim." I stared at the screen. "I am," I typed. He sent, "Grow up." I turned my phone off. I drove without direction. I said to myself, "You trusted them." I answered myself, "You were honest." I said, "That has to count." The ringing in my ears faded, leaving a heavy quiet. I felt cold, then numb. I replayed her silence again and again. Every pause sounded louder than words. When I got home, my place felt empty. I said, "It's over," to no one. The words felt unreal. I sat on the floor and pressed my palms to my face. I wasn't angry yet. I was broken open. I realized the truth didn't protect me.
It exposed me.
I understood then that betrayal doesn't arrive with violence. It arrives with calm explanations, soft voices, and people you love telling you to relax while they take everything you believed was safe. I sat there longer, counting breaths, knowing nothing could be undone, knowing tomorrow would demand strength, and knowing tonight was the last moment I would ever believe excuses over truth from the people I trusted most once. I went to my parents' house the next morning. Ryan was already there. He sat at the table like he belonged there more than me. I said, "We need to talk."
He didn't stand.
He said, "You're making this dramatic." I said, "You slept with my girlfriend." He said, "Lower your voice." I said, "Answer me." He leaned back. "You always think you deserve explanations." I said, "I deserve respect." He smiled. "From who?" I said, "From you." He shrugged. "You put people on pedestals." "That's not my fault." My dad walked in. "What's going on?" he asked. I said, "Ryan betrayed me." Ryan said, "He's emotional." My mom said, "Ethan, calm down." I said, "Don't tell me to calm down." Ryan said, "See?" I said, "You knew what you were doing." He said, "Did I?" I asked him, "How long did you hate me?" He laughed. "Hate?
No.
I said, "Then why?" He said, "Because everything comes easy to you." I stared.
Easy.
He said, "Mom trusts you. Dad defends you. You get love without trying." I said, "You're serious?" He said, "You don't even see it." I said, "You have everything." He said, "I earned it." I said, "So did I." He shook his head. "You're content being small." I said, "I'm content being honest." He said, "Honesty doesn't win." I said, "It should." He said, "That's why you lose." My mom said, "Ryan, enough." Then she looked at me. "Ethan, you need to be mature." That word landed hard. I said, "Mature means accepting betrayal?" She said, "It means not tearing the family apart." I said, "He already did." My dad said, "Blood is blood." I said, "Then why does it feel like I'm the outsider?" Ryan said, "You're acting like a victim." I said, "I was lied to." He said, "You were naive." I said, "You were cruel." He said, "I was honest about wanting more." I said, "You took what wasn't yours." He said, "No one owns people." I said, "You're my brother." He said, "That doesn't mean I stop living." I said, "It means you stop crossing lines." He said, "Lines you drew." I felt cold. I said, "You planned this." He said, "I didn't plan feelings." I said, "You fed them." He said, "So did she." My dad said, "Ethan, apologize for yelling." I said, "For telling the truth?" My mom said, "For causing tension." I looked at them. "You're choosing him." My mom said, "We're choosing peace." I said, "At my expense." Ryan smiled like he'd won. I said, "Do you feel bad?" He paused. "I feel tired." I said, "Of what?" He said, "Of you expecting me to be less, so you feel better." I said, "I expected loyalty." He said, "That's your problem." I felt something break, quietly. I said, "I don't belong here." My mom said, "Don't be dramatic." I said, "I mean it." My dad said, "Sit down." I said, "No," Ryan said, "Run if you want." I said, "I'm not running." He said, "Then what?" I said, "I'm leaving." I grabbed my jacket. My mom said, "You'll regret this." I said, "I already do." Ryan said, "You'll come back." I said, "Not to this." My dad said, "Family forgives." I said, "Family protects." No one answered. I stepped outside and breathed cold air. My hands shook. I said to myself, blood doesn't mean loyal. The words felt heavy and true. I realized love didn't fail me first. Family did. I walked to my car knowing I didn't just lose Olivia. I lost the idea that home was safe, that being related meant being chosen, and that loyalty came free with shared blood. As I drove away, I didn't cry. I felt empty and clear. I understood something final. Belonging isn't automatic. It's earned, defended, and returned. I had given mine freely. They had spent it without care. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I would never beg for a place at a table where betrayal was called maturity, silence was called peace, and love was measured by who caused the least inconvenience. I stopped answering calls. I stopped going places. My phone buzzed and stayed unanswered on the table. Jake showed up anyway. He said, "You alive?" I said, "Barely."
He sat on the floor with me.
"You don't have to talk." I said, "Good." Silence filled the room. He finally said, "You didn't deserve that." I said, "I keep wondering if I did." He shook his head. "That's the damage talking." Emily Brooks texted next. "You skipped work again." I replied, "I know." She wrote, "Coffee?" I said, "I'm not great company." She answered, "I'm not coming for entertainment." We sat quietly. She said, "You don't have to explain." I said, "Everyone else wants explanations." She said, "I want honesty." I said, "I feel stupid." She said, "You feel hurt." I told her, "I replay everything." She asked, "Were you here?" I said, "Excuses I accepted." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I loved them." She nodded. Love makes red flags look like decorations. That stayed with me. Jake said later, "You going to do something about it?" I said, "Like what?" He said, "Revenge." I said, "I'm too tired." He said, "Good." I asked, "Why?" He said, "Anger burns fast. Understanding lasts." I started remembering moments differently. Olivia's silence. Ryan smiles. My parents' words. I said to Emily, "They taught me to shrink." She said, "You learned it. You can unlearn it." I said, "How?" She said, "Stop measuring yourself against people who benefit from you doubting yourself." I went to church without faith, just quiet. Pastor Lewis sat beside me. He said, "You don't look broken." I said, "I am." He said, "You look awake." I said, "I don't know what to do." He said, "Do nothing." I frowned. "That's advice." He smiled. Silence can be power when noise keeps hurting you. I asked, "What about forgiveness?" He said, "Forgiveness isn't access." I asked, "What about family?" He said, "Shared blood doesn't guarantee shared values." I said, "I feel invisible." He said, "Then stop performing for people who don't see you." Jake asked one night, "You miss her?" I said, "I miss who I thought she was." He said, "And your brother?" I said, "I miss who I thought he could be." He nodded. Grief isn't always about death. Emily said, "What do you want now?" I said, "Peace." She said, "Then don't argue with people committed to misunderstanding you." I said, "I want to tell my side." She said, "To who?" I didn't answer. I stared at my phone and imagined messages, apologies, explanations, proof. I deleted drafts. I said out loud, "I won't beg." Jake said, "Good." I said, "I won't explain." Emily said, "Better." I said, "I won't compete." Silence agreed. I realized rock bottom wasn't loud. It spoke softly. It asked hard questions. It said, "Who are you when no one is choosing you?" I answered slowly, "I'm still here." That had to be enough. I stood up one morning and opened the blinds. Light felt unfamiliar. I said, "I choose myself." No one argued. That felt like progress. I went back to work on Monday and told my manager, "I need more responsibility." He asked, "You sure?" I said, "I'm ready." He nodded. "Then prove it." I stayed late without complaint. I stopped checking my phone every 10 minutes. I told myself, react less, observe more. Jake noticed first. He said, "You're quieter." I said, "I'm listening." He asked, "To what?" I said, "To myself." He smirked. "About time." Emily asked, "How are you holding up?" I said, "Better." She raised an eyebrow. That sounded practice. I said, "It's disciplined." She smiled. "That's different." I heard about Ryan and Olivia without asking. A mutual friend said, "They're official now." I said, "Okay." He waited for more. I didn't give it. Later, Jake said, "You see the pictures?" I said, "No." He said, "They look happy." I said, "Appearances work hard." He laughed. "You're colder." I said, "Clearer." Daniel Ross called unexpectedly. "Your parents asked me to review some documents," he said. I asked, "Why are you calling me?" He said, "Because your name was attached to previous plans." I said, "Plans for what?" He paused. "Property. Investments. Things you weren't informed about." My chest tightened. I said, "Tell me." "We met." He said, "You were listed as support, not beneficiary." I said, "Meaning?" He said, "Meaning expectations without authority." I laughed once. "That fits." He said, "Ryan has been under pressure." I asked, "Financial?" He nodded. "More than he shows." I said, "And Olivia?" He said, "She doesn't like instability." I said, "Neither do I." Emily said later, "You're learning their patterns." I said, "I'm seeing consequences." She said, "Quiet ones." I said, "The loud ones come later." Ryan texted me, "We should talk." I replied, "I'm busy." He wrote, "You're avoiding." I answered, "I'm prioritizing." He sent, "You think you won?" I typed, "I walked away." He didn't respond. At dinner with Jake, he said, "That's growth." I said, "It's restraint." He said, "Same thing." I said, "I don't need to prove anything." He raised his glass. "To not competing." I clinked it. "To peace." Work rewarded consistency. My manager said, "You've changed." I asked, "Better or worse?" He said, "Focused." I nodded. That was the goal. I stopped telling my story. I stopped asking for validation. I listened and filed truths away. Emily asked, "Do you miss the noise?" I said, "Sometimes." She said, "What stops you?" I said, "I remember how expensive it was." She smiled. Good answer. Ryan posted another photo. I didn't look. My mom called. "You're distant," she said. I replied, "I'm healthy." She said, "Family matters." I said, "So do boundaries." She sighed. "You're stubborn." I said, "I'm stable." Daniel messaged again. "Things are tightening," he wrote. I asked, For who? He said, not you. I sat back and breathed. I felt no joy, just balance. I told myself, walking away wasn't weakness. I said it again. It was the first act of power. The pain didn't vanish. It transformed. It sharpened my choices. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need apologies. I needed space to become someone who didn't disappear when others took too much. That night, I looked at my reflection and said, I choose myself. The words felt steady. No echo. No argument. Just truth settling in. I learned about Ryan's problems without asking. Jake said, he missed another deadline. I said, that's unfortunate. Jake watched me. You okay hearing that? I said, I'm okay not fixing it. He nodded. That's different for you. I said, it has to be. Emily mentioned Olivia. She called me, she said. I asked, what did she want? Emily said, you. I laughed softly. She knows where I am. Emily said, she sounded scared. I said, fear doesn't equal remorse. Emily didn't argue. Ryan texted again. Work's a mess. I stared at the screen and put the phone face down. Another message followed. You enjoying this? My chest tightened. I said out loud. No, I didn't reply. Silence felt heavy, but clean. Claire Miller called me that night. This is Claire, she said. Ryan's wife. I paused. I know who you are. She said, I thought you should hear this from me. I said, hear what? She sighed. He's not sleeping. He checks my phone. He thinks everyone is lying. I said, I'm sorry. She laughed bitterly. That makes one of us. She said, did he do this to you? I said, yes. She said, I wish I believed you earlier. I closed my eyes. So do I. She said, betrayal spreads, then hung up. I sat there feeling the weight of it. Olivia finally texted me. Can we talk? I typed, no, then erased it. I typed nothing. Another message came. I made a mistake. I whispered, you made a choice. I didn't send it. Jake asked, you want revenge? I said, sometimes. He said, what stops you? I said, I don't want to look like them. He smiled sadly. That's the line. I said, I keep stepping back from it. He said, good. Emily asked, do you feel guilty? I said, for their pain? She said, for not helping. I said, I already did. Too much. She nodded. You're allowed to stop. Ryan called late. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. I don't recognize myself, he said. You always grounded me. I felt the pull. I said to myself, that's not my job anymore. I deleted the message. Claire texted next day. He thinks you're enjoying this. I replied, I'm choosing peace. She answered, I hope I learn that. I said, I hope you do too. At work, my manager said, you seem lighter. I said, I dropped what wasn't mine. He smiled. Keep it that way. I did. I dreamed about old dinners, laughter, plans. I woke up and told myself, nostalgia isn't a contract. The guilt tried to dress itself as kindness. I refused it. I remembered Pastor Lewis saying, silence can be power. I practiced that power. Olivia sent one last message. I miss you. I said nothing. I sat with the urge to respond. I let it pass. I felt stronger for it. Jake said, karma's slow. I said, that's why it works. He raised an eyebrow. You sure you're not bitter? I said, I'm careful. He laughed. That's growth. I walked home thinking about lines I wouldn't cross. I didn't want revenge dressed as justice. I wanted a life that didn't revolve around their mistakes. I chose restraint again. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was hard. It was right. I stood in my kitchen and said, I don't need to witness their downfall. The words settled. I realized karma doesn't rush, because it doesn't need to. It moves when people can no longer outrun themselves. I didn't need to push. I just needed to keep my distance, keep my peace, and trust that poison always shows itself eventually without my help, without my voice, without my hands touching what no longer belonged to me. Ryan called at dawn. I answered because my hands already knew the number. He said, "I messed up." I said, "That's not new." He swallowed. "I lost my job." I said, "I'm sorry." He laughed without humor. "No, you're not." I said, "I can feel sorry without fixing it." He went quiet. He said, "Everything I took came with strings." I said, "It usually does." He said, "She doesn't trust me." I said, "You taught her not to." He said, "I thought winning meant replacing you." I said, "That was never the game." He said, "I see that now." I said, "Seeing late doesn't make it early." He asked, "Can we go back?" I said, "Back to what?" He said, "Being brothers." I said, "We are brothers." He said, "Then why does it feel like I lost you?" I said, "Because you chose to." He breathed hard. "I didn't know it would cost this much." I said, "You never asked the price." He said, "I regret it." I said, "Regret is quiet." He said, "I miss you." I said, "Missing isn't repairing." He said, "What do you want from me?" I said, "Nothing." He whispered, "That hurts." I said, "It should." He said, "I deserve that." I said, "That's the first honest thing you've said." Olivia texted minutes later. "I heard you talk to Ryan." I didn't answer. She called. I picked up and said, "Say what you need to say." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "For what?"
She paused. "For hurting you."
I said, "Be specific." She said, "For choosing myself without caring who I crushed." I said, "That's closer." She said, "I don't expect forgiveness." I said, "Good." She said, "I just needed you to know I feel it now." I said, "Feeling isn't fixing." She said, "I know." She cried softly. "I live with it." I said, "So do I." She asked, "Can we talk sometime?" I said, "This is the talk." She said, "Do you hate me?" I said, "No." She sounded relieved. I added, "I don't trust you." Silence followed. She said, "I understand." I said, "I forgive you." She whispered, "Thank you." I said, "Forgiveness isn't access." She said, "I wasn't asking." I said, "Good." Ryan called back. "What did she say?" I said, "That's not your concern." He said, "I'm trying to make sense of things." I said, "Start with yourself." He said, "I'm scared." I said, "So was I." He said, "You're different." I said, "I had to be." He asked, "Is this it?" I said, "This is the boundary." He said, "I wish I could undo it." I said, "Wishing doesn't move time." He said, "Can you ever trust me?" I said, "Not with my heart." He said, "That's fair." I said, "It's final." After the calls, the room felt still. I didn't feel victory. I felt release. I told myself, restraint is strength. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for tears. I didn't offer hope. I offered truth. Jake texted, "Everything okay?" I replied, "It's finished." Emily wrote, "How do you feel?" I typed, "Clear." That was true. I stood by the window and said out loud, "I forgive without returning." The words didn't shake. They settled. I understood something clean and sharp. Closure isn't loud. It doesn't apologize or beg. It draws a line and stands still. Ryan lost more than he gained. Olivia said sorry for herself. I didn't punish them. I didn't save them. I let regret speak, and when it finished, I closed the door without slamming it. I woke up early and said to myself, "This is a day." No one answered, and that felt right. I made coffee, and sat at the table. I said, "I'm still here." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Jake called. "You free?" he asked.
I said, "Yeah."
He said, "How do you feel?" I thought, then said, "Whole." He laughed softly. "That's new." I said, "It's earned." He replied, "Proud of you." I said, "I know." That surprised me. Emily met me later. She said, "You look lighter." I said, "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine." She smiled. "That's clarity." I said, "It's peace." She asked, "Do you miss them?" I said, "I miss who I was before I doubted myself." She nodded. "You got him back." My mom texted, "We should talk." I stared at it. I replied, "I'm okay." She wrote, "Family matters." I answered, "So does respect." She didn't respond. I didn't feel guilty. I walked through the park and listened to people talk. Laughter didn't hurt anymore. Couples didn't anger me. I said, "This is growth." I remembered believing love meant sacrifice without limits. I said, "Love doesn't ask you to disappear." I remembered believing family meant unconditional loyalty. I said, "Family doesn't excuse harm." I remembered confusing patience with endurance. I said, "Self-respect and suffering." Jake said later, "You don't sound bitter." I said, "I'm done being angry." He asked, "You forgive them?" I said, "I forgave myself first."
He paused.
"That's the hard part." I said, "It was." Emily asked, "Would you do anything differently?" I said, "I'd listen sooner." She said, "To them?" I said, "To me." She smiled. "That's wisdom." I said, "It's survival." I stood in front of the mirror that night. I said, "You didn't lose." I said it again. "You didn't lose." I remembered every moment I stayed quiet to keep peace. I said, "Peace that costs your voice isn't peace." I remembered every excuse I accepted. I said, "Understanding doesn't mean tolerating." I remembered walking away. I said, "That was strength." Ryan didn't call again. Olivia didn't text. The silence felt earned. I didn't need closure from them. I gave it to myself. I said, "I release you." The words felt final. Jake sent a message. "Beer." I replied, "Maybe tomorrow." Emily wrote, "Proud of you." I typed, "Thank you." I didn't overthink it. I let praise land. I thought about the future. I said, "I'll love again." I added, "Without shrinking." I said, "I'll trust again." I added, "With boundaries." I said, "I'll build family." I added, "With people who choose me back." I didn't need revenge. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. I needed honesty, rest, and forward motion. I chose all three. I locked my door and stepped outside. The air felt clean. I said, "I'm not afraid anymore." I walked without looking back. I carried no bitterness, only lessons. I wasn't hardened. I was defined. I learned love is mutual effort. I learned family is behavior, not blood. I learned respect starts with self. I learned walking away can be an act of self-love. I learned survival can be quiet. I learned strength doesn't shout. I walked forward alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was intact. I was grounded. I was enough.